Google Gemini is here, and some people are saying that Google is going to give OpenAI a run for their money. Gemini Ultra outperforms GPT-4 across a number of different benchmarks, even if the model isn't actually available yet, and Google showed an impressive demo of it recently, even though a lot of that demo was actually kind of fake. Nonetheless, the Gemini API is now available, so we're going to take a closer look and see how much of Gemini is actually real and how much of it is just a marketing play by Google. Before we dive into the code, let's take a look at the API documentation and see what's actually possible, and afterwards I'll show you how I can create a Discord bot that uses the Gemini API to generate code, since that's one of the areas that it's apparently really good at. Make sure to stick around for the end of the video where I'm going to discuss some of the limitations of the Gemini API and if it's going to be a serious competitor to OpenAI. Generally speaking, there are not a lot of capabilities with the Gemini API yet. There is a generate content endpoint that's going to take a prompt and generate a response. There's also a chat endpoint which allows you to submit additional messages to a chat that you create, but I would say it's a little bit incomplete, which I'll explain later in the video. There's also the ability to stream responses just like the OpenAI API, and you can also submit images to the API for it to use as a prompt. There is an embeddings endpoint, so if you want to use your own data, it is possible, but you're going to have to set up your own RAG pipeline, or retrieval augmented generation. I have a separate video on that topic if you're curious to learn more. There is one endpoint which I think is particularly useful though, and I wish OpenAI had as well, which is counting tokens. It's really nice to be able to count the tokens and understand what your costs are going to be. One notable feature of the Gemini API is that there is a large section dedicated to safety, and you can essentially configure how conservative this model is going to be across a number of different categories. There are two Gemini models currently available: Gemini Pro, which only processes text in and out, as well as Gemini Pro Vision, which accepts text and images and also responds with only text. So there is no image generation API here, and there's no audio processing model, so there's no way to generate audio or to submit audio to it. I think this is pretty funny because Google's demo video made it look like they were processing real-time video and audio with this API, but that's simply not possible right now, and I'm hoping that at some point in the future they will make the audio APIs and the image generation available, but that's simply not the case right now. The only inputs you can do is text and image, and the only output you'll get is text. Since I'm showing you how to use Gemini inside of Discord, I do have to create a Discord bot, so I'll run through that real quick. We're going to set up a new application, Gemini bot. We go to the URL generator, check bot, copy the URL, and invite the bot to your Discord. We're going to go to the bot page, reset token. Now we have a token that we can use in our application. Also on the bot page, we have to toggle all of these privileged gateway intents. That will allow the bot to respond to users' messages. I'm going to go ahead and paste that Discord token into my .env file. To get access to Gemini, you can go to this URL, which I will provide in the description below, and you can get an API key created in one of your Google Cloud projects. You can also create a new Google Cloud project if you need to. Once you've created the API key, you can go ahead and paste that into the .env file. I've created this JavaScript file which contains the logic to actually invoke the Gemini API and provide a response, and all of this code is available on GitHub, so check it out in the description below. If you've seen my previous video on building a Discord bot with the OpenAI API, you will notice that this code is significantly shorter and lighter. And that is because the Gemini API doesn't have the same capabilities as the OpenAI API. It's a lot closer to the completions API rather than the assistant API, so there are much fewer features and things that we can take advantage of. Essentially, we're just passing a single message from Discord and getting a response based on that. So to quickly walk you through this code, we are checking if the message is coming from a bot, and if so, we are ignoring it. Otherwise, if the message came from a user, we are generating some content with the Gemini API, and we are responding to that message on Discord. You will see at the top here, this is kind of the setup code that we needed to invoke before processing messages. So we needed to create this object with the API key and then specify the Gemini model that we want to use. The thing you'll note here is that we aren't maintaining any sort of context, so every single message is going to be processed separately and not considered in the context of a thread. The Google API does provide a method for submitting history and keeping the context of a thread, but this is actually a little bit deceiving, and I would say the API is not really ready for that sort of thread use case. Basically, with the Google API, you can start a chat, provide some history, and then submit additional messages, but as you'll notice, this chat object is inside of the memory of the program that you're running, which means that if your user's message arrives to another server, it's going to have no knowledge of this chat. and there are no chat or conversation IDs, so there's no way to attach that message to the correct chat unless you have one single server running and processing all of your conversations. This becomes even more infeasible if you're using a serverless architecture like Cloud Functions to process all of these messages, because every time you invoke a new Cloud function, there's absolutely no guarantee that your code knows about all of the chats that are ongoing. I would say that this method is really only useful for passing history in a structured way. So if you have all of the messages from a particular thread, you could create this history object and start a new chat, but I would basically do that every single message you get. I would just retrieve all of the messages and start a new chat. Also, you'll notice that there is no assistant ID or any sort of system prompt, and that is because the Gemini API simply doesn't have those concepts. Every single prompt is going to contain all of the information. So if you want to make some sort of specialized bot that's going to process user messages and handle them in a certain way based on your system instructions, you're going to have to take your instructions and then add the user's message after your instructions so that you have one string prompt. This is similar to what we used to have to do with the openai API maybe a year ago or so. System prompts allow you to control the behavior of your bot, so I think they're a really powerful feature, and I hope we get that with the Gemini API soon. Since Gemini is supposed to be really good at coding, let's go ahead and ask it some coding problems. Write JavaScript code that answers the meaning of life and the universe. Looks like it created a random generator, which is pretty good. 42 is in there, of course, is the top choice. Let's see if we can get Gemini to help Google write a better API for Gemini. One thing I will say is that this API is fast. Like, it responds very quickly compared to OpenAI. That will be interesting to watch as it evolves over time. All right, so it looks like it made some pretty good assumptions about the chat schema. And here we go, we got some different endpoints. Overall, this code looks pretty good. So you can copy this over into your IDE. It's actually quite a bit faster than OpenAI, so I think it could be used for coding in the use case just like what I'm showing here. Let's see how Gemini does with this logic puzzle. If I hang 3 towels out to dry and it takes 2 hours to dry them, how many hours will it take to dry 4 towels? I'm not so sure about that, Gemini. Let's see how our good friend ChatGPT does. It would take the same 2 hours to dry 4 towels as it did for 3 towels. But I think it's important to note that Gemini Pro is roughly equivalent to GPT 3.5, but it is interesting to see that GPT 4 does get the correct answer and we can use it through the API, and Gemini Ultra, the corresponding model, is not currently available through the API. So as it stands, the Gemini API is really a lot more similar to the Completions API from OpenAI that has been available for a long time now, and it doesn't really come close to what the Assistance API is capable of in terms of managing state, retrieving knowledge, function calling, and much more. Even if the model itself is good, it's going to be a challenge using the current API to build a production system. You'll have to manage the conversational context and pick out which messages to submit in every chat. Make sure you're keeping things under the context limit. You'll have to manage your own files and creating embeddings for your data and retrieving it when necessary. There are also no image generation or audio handling capabilities right now, so I hope that becomes available in the future as well. There does seem to be a really big focus on safety, so if you're building some sort of application that's going to focus on sensitive subjects or something geared towards kids, this might make sense to use, but it's still going to be a lot more difficult than working with OpenAI's API. The final thing to note is that Gemini Ultra is not available through the API, so Gemini Pro, which we used in the demo today, is going to be more comparable to GPT 3.5 Turbo and isn't going to give you the same sort of performance that you might see with GPT 4. All in all, it's really great to see another player in the space, but I don't think Gemini is quite ready for prime time just yet. So if you're looking to build something that's a bit more production ready or uses more convenient APIs, check out this video which will show you how to use the OpenAI Assistance API instead. I'll see you there.